Hello. Today I am going to be talking about village studies. And village studies, it appears, would be the study of a village, but actually when you look at the shape it has taken in Indian sociology, it is the study of the idea of India. I mean, there is this notion that India lives in its villages, that India is largely composed of villages, that if you want to understand India, you need to understand its villages, and other ideas that you will see as we talk about in today's class. So, within sociology, how has this idea of the village been dealt with is something that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to do that through looking at the work of Surinder Jodhka, who this recent book, The Indian Village, Rural Lives in the 21st Century, and then his subsequent essay, From Book View to Field View, Social Anthropological Constructions of the Indian Village, is largely how I'm going to present today's lecture. I'm also going to bring in the work of M.N. Srinivas, who was a prominent Indian sociologist in the 1950s and very much iconic in terms of the village studies that he conducted. So, when Surinder Jodhka is writing about the notion of the book view versus the field view, he is looking at how the idea of the Indian village is constructed during the colonial era and then subsequently during the post-colonial era. So, in the colonial era, largely the Britishers drew their ideas of the village by using the Pandits and the Brahmins as their interlocutors and through their references of Sanskrit texts and Indian scriptures, and therefore of book view of its villages emerged, kind of fixed in a particular way and also very clearly a Brahminical view of what constitutes India's villages. This was followed during the British time also, and then much more in the post-colonial times with the field view, which emphasized village studies, which is long-term immersion in a particular villages, and through participant observation, understanding the social dynamics, the social relations that constitute that particular village. Now, there is a particular trajectory that village studies in India has followed, and we'll take a little bit of time to discuss how Indian sociology and its emphasis on village studies has shaped historically. I already mentioned the colonial era reliance on Brahmins and Pandits as interlocutors, and therefore emergence of the idea of the village, largely referred to as Indology, right? The study of India, but through its villages. This also was constructed using particular notions of a static, of a traditional, of an unchanging notion of a village, and this was in contrast to the more dynamic West, right? So, I've put up here Edward Said's book Orientalism. In Orientalism, Edward Said talks about how the Occident, that is the West, created a particular exoticized, stereotyped notion of the East or of its colonies as something that is unchanging, as something that is stable, almost ahistorical, very traditional, and had more primitive or uncivilized ways of being in this world. So, this particular idea of the Orient, right, of the East, of the colonized world is what the West brought to their understanding of India. This was also, as village studies was being shaped in the post Second World War era, one, there was already this received wisdom related to India's unchanging villages, but then it was also the Western concern. If you remember, the post Second World War time is the time of the Cold War. It's the time of great anxiety in Western Europe and in the United States of an impending revolution in their neighborhood, right? So, one had to anticipate and stop that revolution, and one of the ways of doing it was to understand the working classes, was to understand the exploited classes, and to understand the peasants. So, in the United States also, peasant studies emerges as a solid sub-discipline within sociology, and some of those concerns are moved to the third world. Now, the third world itself is being watched through with great interest, because both the first world and the second world want the third world to align with them. And so many of these studies of peasant groups, of working class groups, of villages are then funded by Western foundations such as the Ford Foundation. One of the studies that I talk about today, for example, is funded by the Ford Foundation. There is also the orthodoxy within the developmental discourse of a linear and a progressive, stage-wise way of looking at historical development, such as there is the underdevelopment, primitive agricultural societies, which then would develop to more developed societies in the image of their Western counterparts. This particular way of looking at the world, this particular way of looking at history also greatly influenced the aspirations of the newly independent nation state. So in fact, Jodhka points to the notions that Gandhi held about India. And while he classified Gandhi as a traditionalist who would have a very romantic notion of India, and that India lies in its villages, but he also says that the modernists such as Nehru and Ambedkar bought into this view of the Indian village as static, but also as a den of darkness, as a place where no change ever happens, and including no change ever happens, and that it is embroiled in hierarchies and needs to be changed. Marx also in his writings had this notion of a very stable village, of a historical village, of an undynamic village that needs to be revolutionized, and he argued that it is perhaps the British that will bring dynamism and the revolution to the Indian village. So you see how all of these ideas, both national but also largely influenced by developments around the world, are influencing the shape that Indian sociology is taking in terms of village studies. Much of this fixed view also comes from Macaulay's idea of India, Macaulay's idea of India. I want to take a couple of minutes in fact, to show you this film produced as an American educational film that will highlight this static view, right, this unchanging view of India. So let's take a few minutes to watch it. And in fact, if you go on YouTube to watch the full film, I've only partitioned off a couple of minutes from it for us to watch as part of this class, but the link is given here. If you watch it yourself, you would notice that in the YouTube channel, there is in the description, it states film produced by an American educational society. This was produced in 1959, but has anything changed? So a lot of this perspective prevails even today, and Jodhka challenges that in his text.
They are people born of the same soil, people deeply religious, whose daily activities reflect an intimate bond with their God. It is morning in the home of Dondu, a peasant. He has wakened his God with an offering to keep him working at his side, to bring blessing to his field and his crop, to his house, and his wife Durga, the mother of his children and the keeper of his house. Durga is India, Dondu is India, and their home and children are India, immutable India, always the same, 7 days a week, year in and year out. The oxen are Dondu's faithful companions at work. The oxen, the wooden plow, and his son, Hondu. Lucky Vital can go to school. He is the one member of the household who will know how to read soon. His mother never had that chance. Married at 13, she never has changed the routine of her work. Dondu never went to school. He followed his father to the field from the day he began to walk. Durga followed her mother in the household chores as soon as she could walk. This is the land that Dondu's ancestors worked as tenants, and now Dondu owns it. 5 acres in all. 5 acres to feed a family. Come on, good oxen, pull the plow and dig in deep to bring out the seeds of Dondu's sweat, as you've done for thousands of years, without rest for the man, without rest for the soil, yielding fruit twice a year or not at all, as pleases God. Come on, good oxen, turn the wheel and pull up the precious water. Water that carries life across the fields. Water mixed with sweat to moisten the furrows that will bear the wheat. And wheat means food for Dondu, food and income. It takes 1/3 of a good harvest to feed the family, another 1/3 to pay the taxes, the rest to pay the debts, and usually nothing remains to provide for tomorrow. All this Dondu thinks as he follows the oxen along the familiar furrows of his field. From the distance he hears the squeaking of the water wheel, and he listens to the reassuring murmuring as it trickles down the irrigation ditches toward his fields. For in one way, Dondu's village is lucky. It has good water wells and irrigation ditches, while hundreds of villages have none.
So you see in the film this unchanging view of India's villages, right? The people's routines are the same, intergenerationally, every day, at whatever time scale you look at it. It's very predictable, it's very static, gendered social relations are fixed, and hierarchies are also fixed in place. So this is the view that this particular film quite clearly shows and then represents the larger perspective that prevailed at that time about the Indian village. So let's read from this quote from Jodka's book, where Charles Metcalfe is writing, "The Indian village communities were little republics, having nearly everything they wanted within themselves, and almost independent of foreign relations. They seemed to last where nothing else lasted. Dynasty after dynasty tumbled down. Revolution succeeded evolution, but the village community remained the same." So it appears to be that the village was a static, was a priori, was a historical object that lay there, whatever else moved around it. And this was a very powerful idea at the time that shaped generations of colonial rulers, but then also post-colonial leaders in our country. In the 1950s, we move from the book view. Actually, much earlier we moved from the book view, but 1950s, 1960s and 1970s see a whole plethora of books that were studying the village from the field. So the field view coming up. Studies that conducted ethnographic studies in faraway villages, and in fact, these were so, the village study became such an important part of Indian sociology that in fact the authors who studied them became, their name got forever linked with the particular village that they conducted participant observation in. So Srinivas conducted research in Rampura, Dubey in Shamirpet, Andre Batel in Shripuram, Ishwaran in Shivapur. These became legendary pairs of names. Most of these were edited collections, but then also most of these had essays by a very similar set of people. So for example, M.N. Srinivas had an essay in all of these edited volumes coming around at that time. Now, what explains that these volumes were coming about at that time? And largely that had to do with the post-colonial states' aspiration of becoming a developed world, and the village was seen as the place where one needs to act in order for India to become a developed world. So I've put up here Rostow's model of modernization theory of the stages of development, which talks about traditional society, and the village was seen as the iconic traditional society, right? If you wanted to study traditional society, you would go to the village. This was the same in Europe, this was the same in the United States, and it was the same in sociology in India. Then some external factor comes and the preconditions for takeoff develop. There is takeoff, that is the development of a manufacturing center, so industrialization. there is the push or the drive to maturity, and then eventually the developed world is considered that which is a high mass consumption society. So this view of linear progress, this view where it's already always pre-decided which direction a country or a state or a village would move in, was accepted quite uncritically by the sociologists and the politicians of that time. M.N. Srinivas questions this to some extent, although he is also engaged in a similar project. But he wants to do so, he wants that trajectory to move forward, he wants progress for the village, but he wants to also bring in the voices of those that he is studying. So he writes, village studies are meant to sensitize planners to the felt needs of the people. So remember, this is the time of the 5-year plan. So the government has to make a 5-year plan, and what were they to base these 5-year plans on? So the economists would give the economics data, but they were looking at the sociologists and the anthropologists to give them on the ground the field view, to give them a real sense of the needs of the villagers. So therefore, a large part of sociology was an exercise in informing the planner. Planners and government tended to treat people like dough in their hands. The fact that people had resources of their own, physical, intellectual and moral, and that they could use them to their advantage was not recognized by those in power. So M.N. Srinivas, through his participant observation, is also trying to push for bringing in the intellectual and the moral presence of the villager in the planning discourse. Why was village studies so critical, or why at that time in the from 50s to 1970s? Largely, since the country was in that trajectory towards development and it needed to understand Indian society in order to do so, the village was considered as the right medium through which a scientific understanding of Indian society can be developed. So participant observation and field studies and understanding of the village is how one can learn about it and therefore shape it to move towards progress and scientific development. The idea of the village also identified with the idea of India, and for most citizens of the country, it was also seen as a focal point of reference for individual prestige and identification. Here I want to bring to your attention the short story by Sadat Hasan Manto titled Toba Tek Singh. In Toba Tek Singh, for those of you who've read it, you would remember the title of the story, Toba Tek Singh, is the name of the protagonist given to him in the lunatic asylum where he is currently residing. But it is also the name of the village that he belongs to. So continuously in the story, in fact, once he learns of the partition of British India, he is asking which side is Toba Tek Singh, then where is Toba Tek Singh going to be? So his identification with his village is symbolic of that identification that that in this idea many people residing in India had with the village, right? The notion of the village as the root, and therefore it was important to study this if you wanted to understand India. Villages were seen as having a historical continuity and as relatively stable, this coming from that unchanging view idea, and were the principal social and administrative units through which governments could act. So keeping all these in view, they were the right places to start studying Indian society. Moreover, they were not just places. So the village, Andre Batel, prominent Indian sociologist who in fact just passed away this February in 2026, has argued that the village is not just a place. The village is the powerful idea shaping Indian trajectory. It's a constellation of Indian values. So it represents them, right? So therefore, it becomes very important to understand and see the real India. This was also a time of rapid transformation. So Indian state is modernizing, newer cities are coming up, newer infrastructures are coming up. There is a new idea of India as an independent modern state. So in the midst of all this, in the midst of a democracy taking shape in India, the villages are also transforming. And so a study of the village was seen as an opportunity to document and to see these transitions and to capture these places which would then eventually change or give way to modernization. Village studies, I already said this, were conducted through participant observation, that is deep immersion of the scholars, sometimes for 1 or 2 years before they started writing about that particular village. Now, this deep immersion also came with its own set of problems, right? So, because if you would go immerse, you would associate, oftentimes many of these scholars would associate with the upper caste. So, then they would fold into the caste structure of that particular village. And therefore, they would get that perspective. Many of them found it very hard to study the village from the perspective of the untouchables. And many of them, if they tried to, they would be looked at as with suspicion as not respecting the caste hierarchies of the village. So, all of these challenges was something that they were facing as they were doing village studies, and these challenges then also help shape the kind of sociology they were able to generate from these village studies. Now, this myth of cute little independent romanticized republics that were self-sufficient has been a point of great contestation. So, Andre Batel writes, at least as far back in time as living memory went, there was no reason to believe that the village was fully self-sufficient in the economic sphere. So, he shows how trade was always happening, some goods prepared somewhere were being sold elsewhere, people were always going to other villages to help with at different points in terms of harvesting. Caste lineages and caste networks were there, and so it was never fully self-sufficient ever in history, is what Batel argues. Dubé writes in a differently nuanced manner, village communities all over the Indian subcontinent have a number of common features. The village settlement as a unit of social organization represents a solidarity different from that of the kin, the caste and the class. Different castes and communities inhabiting the village are integrated in its economic, social and ritual pattern by ties of mutual and reciprocal obligations sanctioned and sustained by generally accepted conventions. Notwithstanding the existence of groups and factions inside the settlement, people of the village can and do face the outside world as an organized, compact whole. So, it's a nuanced picture that is emerging now. So, while there are fractions and all of that inside the village, but then when they meet the outside world, Dubé argues that they do so as a collective. So, in this whole debate, it largely became about whether the village is a unified structure living in unity, or that it is very diverse, or India is a constellation of self-sufficient village republics that nevertheless share a cultural unity. So, all of these arguments are doing the rounds. Let's read some of them to get a sense of what are the debates around unity and diversity in Indian sociology of villages at that time. In 1958, Lewis is writing, the caste system divides the village and weakens the sense of village solidarity. The caste generally represents a distinct ethnic group with its own history, tradition and identification, and each caste lives in more or less separate quarters of the village. Each caste forms a separate little community. So, be careful here. He is not saying that the village is a whole community. It is saying each caste is its own little community. Then Srinivas writes, the tendency to stress intra-caste solidarity and to forget inter-caste complementarity is to ignore the social framework of agricultural production in pre-British India. Caste-wise division of labor forced different castes living in a local area to come together in the work of growing and harvesting crops. Landowners forged inter-caste ties not only with artisan and servicing castes but also with castes providing agricultural labor. Again, in context of a non-monetized or minimally monetized economy and very little spatial mobility, relationships between households tended to be enduring. Enduringness itself has a value, and hereditary rights and duties acquired ethical overtones. So Srinivas here is talking about a kind of reciprocity within castes, right? And he's talking about enduringness, which is perhaps coming from this notion of the unchanging view, and maybe not. Bailey writes in 1960, the system works the way it does because the coercive sanctions are all in the hands of dominant caste. This is important. So there is reciprocity, there is interrelationship, there is dependence on each other, and yet that system has a particular structure which stays in place because of the hierarchies of the dominant castes. There is a tie of reciprocity, but it is not a sanction of which the dependent castes can make easy use. So he's giving us the notion of hierarchy in this reciprocal relationship. So within this, the unity and diversity debate is unfolding in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now I want to briefly speak about the work of M.N. Srinivas, his very important contributions to Indian sociology. M.N. Srinivas was educated at the University of Bombay and in Oxford. You could largely place him in the structuralist functionalist approach that he learned in Oxford, through which he looks at castes as playing a particular role in society. Remember the functionalist approach we talked about? So where each caste has its function and is fulfilling that, and that caste is a particular structure that dictates social relations. He was one of the founders for the Baroda School of Sociology. He's also been head of the Delhi School of Economics, Sociology, and has played an immense role in the development of Indian Sociological Association and several departments of sociology in our country. Now his theoretical contributions, I want to start in fact with his methodological contribution and his contribution to the debate, the insider-outsider debate within methodology. So largely in the West at that time, it was argued that as anthropologists, as social anthropologists or as sociologists, one should be studying a society that is not their own, right? So because the argument was that if you study your own society, you would bring your own biases to it. M.N. Srinivas, on the other hand, argued that anybody that you study other than yourself is the other. So it is the insider-outsider debate doesn't quite hold. Specifically, he talked about the case of India also, and he wrote, differences of language, dialect, religion, sect, caste, class, and ethnicity confront Indian anthropologists at every point. So they can find the other, they can find the outsider in an adjacent village or tribe or a backward slum, in fact in their backyard, right? So he studied his own area, he studied South India and wrote extensively about villages in that area. He also argued for a field view. He argued for developing the Indologists or the Sanskritized view of that was referred to by the Britishers through scriptures and through their interactions with Brahmins and Pandits. And he argued that view had a very static perception. He argued that through his field studies, what he's seen is that caste is in fact a very dynamic phenomena. It is not quite as fixed. What does he mean by that? He coins the term Sanskritization. Well, he actually first coins the term Brahminization, where he shows, when he sees that the lower castes are adopting the practices of the upper castes in order to raise themselves in the caste hierarchy. Once he observes that it is not just the practices of the Brahmin caste that the lower castes are copying, but those of other upper castes also, or whoever is the dominant caste in that particular village, then he replaces that term with Sanskritization. He writes, The articulated criteria of ranking were usually ritual, religious or moral, resulting in concealing the importance of secular criteria. The influence of the latter was, however, real. What does he mean by that? So, quite obviously, in the power hierarchy that exists in the village, there is religion and caste. So, that is the more religious idea of how hierarchies are constructed in the village. But then, alongside that, the secular criteria, such as how much land does one own, how much wealth does one have, is there a family member in government service, so position in government service and in village organization. The age of a person mattered, and also distinctive personality traits, like if somebody had a charismatic personality, they could rise up potentially in the village hierarchy. So of the villages that he studied, he said each village had a dominant caste, and it was not necessary that the dominant caste belonged to the Brahmins. It could be any other caste that had raised itself to an important status in that particular village. He also gives a disclaimer that untouchables did not have that possibility. They were stuck in their position in the caste system. He writes, a caste may be said to be dominant when it preponderates numerically over the other castes, and when it also wields preponderant economic and political power. A large and powerful caste group can be more easily dominant if its position in the local caste hierarchy is not too low. This can happen through, getting an English education, getting westernized, and this you would observe even today, right? So if you see people in the village, if you see all of us, in fact, one aspires towards social mobility, and one of the ways to do that is seen as getting an English medium education. So, and by becoming more westernized. So that he observes in the village of his time also. Then he writes, but when a caste enjoys one form of dominance, it is frequently able to acquire the other forms as well in course of time. Now this reminds me of Boudreaux's habitus and his notion of cultural capital, economic capital and social capital, and how having one form of capital can quite well translate into another form of capital. It's slightly similar in that sense, that if there is a vast amount of caste group in a particular village that has immense amount of land ownership and has positions of authority in the government, that particular caste group can quite easily acquire the dominant caste status in that village. Thus, a caste which is numerically strong and wealthy will be able to move up in the ritual hierarchy if it Sanskritizes its ritual and way of life. So, what he means by this is adopting practices like becoming vegetarian, by becoming teetotalitarian, by following the rituals and prayers of upper caste, by behaving like the upper caste do. And so, through that process, and also loudly and persistently proclaiming itself to what it wants to be, a caste group can move higher up in the hierarchy and potentially become the dominant caste. He gives a disclaimer. He writes, this applies only to caste Hindus. Untouchability constitutes a serious obstacle to group mobility. So he's very careful in sharing the dynamic view of the caste system, which is dynamic within a range. It is not dynamic totally. So let's come to Surinder Jodhkar. Surinder Jodhkar is a professor in JNU and is a prolific writer on villages in India, on caste, on inequality, and this work of his that I'm presenting on how the colonial state legitimizes its rule by presenting villages as stable, static, uncivilized, primitive, and the coming of the British rulers as something that will add dynamism and civilize the primitive inhabitants, and then how that particular wisdom is taken up as acceptable knowledge and almost uncritically by nationalist aspirations, and how that shapes Indian sociology. So he reminds us, for example, that Ambedkar, who was a modernist and did excellent work in discussing caste hierarchies, looked at the village as den of ignorance. Nehru also looked at it as den of ignorance. But then if you look at Ambedkar's own experience and the discrimination he faces in the city of Baroda, then it doesn't quite explain the binary in terms of caste hierarchies between rural and urban. In fact, Jodhka in his work challenges the rural-urban binary, and he says we must always look at them as related to each other, drawing from each other. He writes, contrary to the popular perception that villages are disappearing with rapid urbanization and economic growth, rural settlements continue to remain important sites for understanding the social dynamics of contemporary India. He's writing in today's context, and his book that I shared in the title slide about rurality in India, and he says that these are dynamic places and these are quite interlinked to the developmental trajectory, to the aspirations of the country, and to the way things are shaping up. They're not dead. He argues in that book View to Field View paper that this notion that somehow the villages have declined and that they also decline as a subject of study in Indian sociology. He says this happens post liberalization, where the village kind of slowly fades away from Indian sociology, and his work has been to consistently bring it back and show that it is an important site for understanding social relations in India. In also caste, he says caste has also not disappeared from rural India. What has changed are the ways in which caste identities are articulated and mobilized, and there is more and more need to understand these different ways in which caste identities take shape, are mobilized, and the kind of the impact they have on Indian society. The example he gives is of politics and affirmative action. So on one hand, looking at the entry of lower castes into Indian politics appears to be playing with caste groups, also given them a platform, a voice, and has changed Indian politics forever. On the other hand, it has also reinforced caste as there, so having caste has not having vanished. And he's also careful to note that caste hierarchies have not vanished in India. Caste hierarchies remain despite a few leaders from the lower castes having entered Indian politics. So this is the view of Indian village, this dynamic view of Indian village that I wanted to leave us with in this course, and see you in the next class. Thank you.